Welcome back to Face the Nation. As President Biden met with Middle Eastern leaders last week, he was accompanied by Amos Hochstein, the Special Presidential Coordinator for International Energy Affairs. He's with us now. Mr. Hochstein, welcome to Face the Nation. Good to have you here in person.
It's great to be here in person. Thank you.
So you were one of the few U.S. officials in the room when President Biden met with Saudi leaders. Why was this trip worth the political risk? What did you get?
Well, I think this was a historic trip. First, it started just landing in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah as the first ever flight for a president to fly from Israel directly to Saudi Arabia, with the backdrop of Saudi Arabia announcing that they're opening the skies for the first time for Israeli aircraft, for all aircraft, including flights to and from Israel over its airspace. Comes on the backdrop of a major achievement over the last few months of a ceasefire in Yemen, where thousands of people have been killed over the last 7 years. This has been the longest ceasefire we've had, with a commitment from Saudi Arabia to work to extend the ceasefire even further. Major announcements for food security and achieving contributions from the GCC, from the Gulf countries, on food security.
But none on oil yet.
Well, we had major announcements on cooperation on energy writ large. And if you recall, just before the president announced his trip, just a few days before that, OPEC Plus made a major shift in its policies, recognizing that since Putin started amassing forces, the markets have been affected and that there was a supply-demand issue, and announced increases in supply of 50% for July and August. Right. And based on what we heard on the trip, I'm pretty confident that we'll see a few more steps in the coming weeks.
So OPEC Plus meets August 3rd. Saudi has very little spare capacity. So are you saying you got a wink and a nod that they're going to pump more?
I think what we discussed, first of all, it's not just about Saudi. It's about, we met with the GCC and with Saudi Arabia. I'm not going to go into how much spare capacity there is in Saudi Arabia and in UAE and Kuwait, et cetera. But there is additional spare capacity. There is room for increased production. As we've told producers in the United States, we've had conversations over the last several months and weeks with OPEC, and I believe that there is still more room to see additional steps in the coming weeks.
Saudi says it's got like 1 million spare barrel capacity.
Again, it's not just about Saudi. This is OPEC, so there are other countries as well. So what we need is to see a little bit more. But let's look at what has happened since the president announced his trip. Oil prices at that point were at about $120. Today, oil prices are around $100, $101. Right. So that's a $20 decline based on the
Some of that due to economic concerns, though. China looking like it's slowing, and concerns here about consumption going down.
So there's no doubt, there's never one reason why oil prices go up or why oil goes down. As you know, when oil prices go up, they tend to say there's only one reason, that's the political leadership. But if you think about it this way, over the last few months, the president has supplied the U.S. market with 1 million barrels a day, which is a historic level.
From the Strategic
Petroleum Reserve. We've never done that before.
And that, ends in September?
No, that will end towards the end of the year.
Will it end towards the end of the year? Can you afford to stop putting emergency supply on the market? Well,
look at what has happened. The private sector, as we talked to them in the United States, said they can increase production in the United States by about 1 million barrels a day, but it's going to take time to invest in it. It'll come at the end of the year. So we stepped in, the president stepped in and said, I'll fill that gap.
Right.
So hopefully my expectation is that the private sector in the U.S. will have those increases coming, so we don't need to have the emergency from the U.S. government. In the meantime, we've seen the prices, both the oil price, but also the price at the pump has come down at the fastest rate that we have seen in over a decade. So from over $5. And remember this, just a few weeks ago.
Still pretty high, $5, still pretty high. It may have come down.
It's not $5 anymore, it's now $4.55, and I expect it to come down more towards $4. And we already have many gas stations around the country that are below $4. So this is the fastest decline rate that we've seen against a major increase of oil prices during a war in Europe, where one of the parties in the war is the third largest producer in the world. So these are extraordinary circumstances. We've taken very tough measures to address them right away, both for the American consumer, but really for global economy too.
Well, we'll watch to see if those gas prices continue to fall. I want to ask you about what the administration is pushing around the world, which is this concept of putting a cap on the price of Russian oil that is sold, so that it's not cutting back on the amount, but rather the windfall profits. Putin can profit off of it. What's to stop Vladimir Putin from just saying, fine, I'm just going to stop pumping?
Well, I think that the price cap.
Doesn't that ruin your plan if he does that?
Well, first, he could do that tomorrow, regardless of what we do on a price cap. You know, Putin has been an unreliable supplier, unfortunately. But I think what we're doing is we're designing the mechanism so that he still would have revenues. He needs those revenues to, that's the only revenues he really has in his country. There's nothing else in Russia except for oil and gas.
Well, JP Morgan says he's got enough cash that he's sitting on that he could cut by 5 million barrels in that extreme example that the price of oil would go up to over $300 a barrel, almost $400 a barrel.
Well, what we want to be able to do is to mitigate where the price of oil on the world market doesn't actually impact Russia at all, because we're going to put a price cap so that all they have is to get that price and no more than that.
Right.
We believe that that is the way to do it. So if prices go up, he still won't get that price, and we can reduce that price.
Yet? Why would India or China comply?
Well, first, at the G7 a couple of weeks ago, the G7 endorsed this idea as a good idea. We're now starting to have the conversations with the major consumers. And I would ask the question the other way around. Doesn't every buyer try to get a lower price? So I think every buyer is incentivized to pay less. And I'll go a step further. Right now, regardless of what you see as the global oil price, that's not what Putin's getting. So these headlines about Putin getting some kind of a math between how much is he selling times the price of oil in the world, that's not his revenue, because he's already agreed to major discounts. But he's still taking in money and he's still funding this war. So that's what we're trying to stop.
Right. But in the meantime, I want to ask you quickly about the president's climate change efforts. This bill and his proposal is completely stalled right now. The president says he's going to take executive action. What is the plan? What are you going to actually do here in the United States?
Well, I think we've tried to get a plan where we can incentivize, create incentives for U.S. investment.
You can't block new oil and gas drilling, right? You can't do some of those things because they would counter your efforts.
Well, I think what we want to do in this bill that we have proposed, and we are hopeful that, we still hope that that's what Congress does, is to give the kind of incentive assurances that we can have additional American investment in climate, renewable energy, electric vehicles. Why wouldn't we want to do that? Why would we want to create an environment in which China's ahead of us? The rest of the world is making the investments and we're not. We want to be able to put the kind of incentives that there'll be additional investment in the infrastructure for renewable energy, for solar, for wind, and for electric vehicles, and for our nuclear fleet in this country. That's how we get to climate. We didn't get that today. The president is determined to take some action that he can through executive orders and through other actions.
Like
we'll see what we can do this week and in the coming weeks. But again, I think that the responsibility here is to be able to invest into our future. Whether we like it or not, some don't like it. This is the future of energy markets in the United States and around the world. We got to decide, do we want the U.S. to lead, or do we want the Chinese to lead this?
You got to convince Senator Joe Manchin. We'll be talking about that ahead in the segment. Thank you very much for coming in. We'll be right back. For a broader look at some of the economic headwinds we are facing as a country, we're joined now by Jason Furman. He was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Obama administration and is now a professor at Harvard. Excuse me. He joins us from Boston this morning. Good morning to you. Inflation is running extremely hot, as you know, up 9.1% over the past 12 months. Shelter, food, gas, all the things the Fed can't really control, that they're hurting people. Are we at the peak yet?
You know, Margaret, I don't know. Oil prices have been coming down. Gasoline prices have been coming down. So that headline number, that's the one that Americans really feel could be coming down. What was worrisome in this last report is even if you strip out all the volatile things, the underlying core was actually strengthening. We might see the 12-month numbers rising in the months to come.
Ouch. You know, looking at forward planning, Bank of America is now predicting a mild recession in the second half of the year. JP Morgan says the risk of recession is uncomfortably high. But Citigroup's CEO said she sees nothing in the data now to indicate that we're on the cusp of recession. So this is the big money bet. What's your bet? Where are we on the possibility of recession?
Look, I'm not that much more worried than I am normally, but I don't have any confidence in that, in part because the economic signals are really unclear. In the first half of the year, it looks like GDP fell, but jobs grew quite a lot. You have business leaders saying they're worried we're going to go into recession, but they're still hiring people. If they're bankers, they're still making loans to people. You have consumers saying they're really negative about the economy, but they're still spending money. It's hard to square a lot of these contradictory signals right now.
Right, but you're saying it is quite possible, it's just not clear.
Oh, it's certainly possible, but and it's certainly more likely than it normally is. The risks are much greater than they normally are. But the idea that a recession is a foregone conclusion or even over 50% chance, I don't see that, but I'm looking through a cloudy rear view mirror trying to guess what's going to happen ahead of us. Fair.
I want to ask you about something you've been tweeting quite a lot about, and that is the fiscal side of the spending plan here. There have been these weeks of talks, we just discussed it, over the president's proposals on climate spending, a number of other things, and it collapsed, these negotiations, in recent days. You've been tweeting in favor of the Democrats' bill, which apparently would expand an income tax on individuals making over $400,000. Why do you think it's advisable to raise taxes in a period of inflation like that? People like Senator Manchin say we shouldn't be due to inflation.
Yeah, so Margaret, Senator Manchin is absolutely right to be more worried about inflation after the Friday report. That means we're going to need to do more. The Fed's probably going to telegraph larger rate increases in the future. It also means Congress should be trying to do their part and helping out. If they can cut the deficit, including raising taxes on high-income households, that would reduce a bit of spending in the economy. It would cool the economy down a little bit and actually take some pressure off the Fed. The Fed would not need to raise rates by quite as much if Congress did their job. So clearly this is a time where everyone should be helping out in bringing inflation down.
Well, what's interesting is that when you were on this program back in May, you said one of the reasons the U.S. has incredibly high inflation was the emergency spending that President Biden signed into effect back in March of 2021. And it was spending like that Senator Manchin points to and says, see, this is why we need to wait. So why was he right in the past and he's wrong now to be concerned about spending?
Yeah, the difference is that we're talking about something exceedingly different than then. That was $1.9 trillion of new spending. Now on the table was something like $500 billion of deficit reduction. It was a net reduction in the deficit. I think almost anyone, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum that was an expert on this topic, would agree that would lower inflation. There's Republican friends of mine that would say, oh, I don't like lowering inflation by raising taxes on high-income households. They might have some other way they'd rather lower inflation. But unambiguously, this is going to bring inflation down. And from my values and perspectives, it would bring it down in a fair way, certainly much more fair than the tiny reduction in inflation we'll get if 12 million people get cut off their health subsidies and see their premiums go up at the end of the year.
Well, President Biden issued a statement saying he would endorse this slimmed down version of the bill that would, that Senator Manchin is endorsing, that would lower healthcare premiums and prescription drug costs. Are you saying that slimmed down version is just not meaningful?
Oh, look, I think that slimmed down version helps. It would lower inflation both because of the overall deficit reduction and then very directly by slowing the growth of prescription drugs costs. That would be in both likely the private sector and the public sector that you would see that slowdown. So if that bill is the best you can get, and I certainly don't know enough about tactics in Washington to judge, that bill would be a very good thing to do. Even within that bill, by the way, there are some open questions, at least in my mind. If you're not going to raise taxes, how about enforcing the tax code we already have? $600 million goes uncollected every year. Audits of millionaires are down 70%. If you fund the IRS, you can collect a lot more taxes without raising tax rates on anyone.
Very quickly, will it add to inflation if all these states, Massachusetts, California, Indiana, Delaware, hand out checks to offset inflation?
Absolutely. Every one of those states is raising inflation nationwide to benefit the citizens in their own states. Collectively, we'll be worse off because of it.
All right, Jason Furman, thank you for your analysis and for joining us today. We'll be back in a moment. One of the more startling numbers from last week's Consumer Price Index was the cost of rent, which is soaring at the fastest pace in 36 years. Here in the nation's capital, average home rental costs have jumped more than 11% in just the past year. The national rate is nearly 6%. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser has made the push for affordable housing a part of her agenda, and she joins us. Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So I want to ask you, the New York Times had this piece on the housing crisis and homelessness in America, and it highlighted D.C. as just one of those cities that has just persistently not had enough housing to meet demand. You've been working on reducing homelessness. Is the prime issue supply?
Well, we've been working on creating affordable housing and producing more and preserving more. And we are among the jurisdictions, I would say, that lead the nation in being a local partner in production. So just in the last 7 years, we've invested more than $1.4 billion in doing exactly that. We're equally invested in making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring in our city, and we have a plan to get there. We've seen our rates of family homelessness, for example, decrease by 78%. Chronic homelessness also, we're attacking and driving those numbers down for most categories. So what we see is in a city like ours where people want to live and want to work, that we always have to be producing more housing.
So I'm wondering then, in an environment where we are now, where interest rates are going up, is that discouraging builders from producing what you need? Do you need the federal government to step in and provide some sort of support?
Well, we're certainly are going to be able to do less with the very historic investments that we've made. So we're concerned about that. But what I know that we're doing everything locally that we can. We have a tool called the Housing Production Trust Fund. This year alone, we'll invest $450 million in new units. We've set a goal of building 36,000 new units. So we're always looking for the federal government to be a partner. And I have to say that in coming out of this pandemic and everything that the federal government was able to do to help cities like ours keep people housed with American Rescue Plan dollars, with making sure that we're preventing evictions and keep people from getting evicted has been very helpful.
The Washington Post reported last week that homeless shelters in D.C. were filling up, and groups are getting overwhelmed by these buses that the governors of Texas and Arizona are sending here full of migrants. How significant is this influx? How many people?
Well, this is a very significant issue. We have for sure called on the federal government to work across state lines to prevent people from really being tricked into getting on buses. We think they're largely asylum seekers who are going to final destinations that are not Washington, D.C. I worked with the White House to make sure that FEMA provided a grant to a local organization that is providing services to folks. But I fear that they're being tricked into nationwide bus trips when their final destinations are places all over the United States of America.
So it's not just local taxpayers picking up the tab. You're saying the federal government is helping.
Well, local taxpayers are not picking up the tab and should not pick up the tab. And we really need a coordinated federal response. We know that it's done for refugees who come to the states from all points of the world, and the same has to be done in this situation.
I also want to ask you about monkeypox. 108 infections here in the district, according to the CDC numbers. Is the outbreak more significant than that? And are you prepared for the spike when it comes to available vaccine? You're Democratic colleague in New York City says he needs more vaccine.
We need more vaccine. We've gotten just over 8,000 doses. We estimate that we need about 100,000 doses to address the current target population.
Wow.
So we need more doses for sure, and we know that work is being done. We already have a very robust testing regime, and we've modeled it on what we were able to do with COVID, and we're going to continue to test. And I think because of that robust testing, we're going to see more cases. But we want people to pay attention to ways of protecting themselves, especially by getting vaccinated when the vaccine is available.
Has the federal government promised you those doses?
We know our health department works with the CDC and others, and so as the vaccine is available, we're going to be ready to distribute it.
I also want you have a big portfolio here in the nation's capital.
Indeed.
I want to ask you about the risk of political violence. Homeland Security has warned the entire country should essentially be prepared for more political violence. How are you planning for it here in D.C.?
Well, we as the nation's capital, we're kind of always on high alert as a target of all manner of political violence. And unfortunately, we've seen that of a domestic nature in the last several years. So our
Supreme Court justices. January 6th.
January 6th, the events surrounding the murder of George Floyd, all. But we also see demonstrations and First Amendment protests throughout the year. Some you don't hear about, but our police are out there working every day to make sure people can peacefully protest, but also keep our city safe. So it is an ongoing high-level interaction with our federal partners, including Federal Homeland Security, all the federal agencies that are in DC, but our Metropolitan Police Department is there to support them in many cases and lead in others.
All right. Mayor Bowser, thank you for your time.
Thank you
for coming in
Thank
today.
you. My pleasure.
And we will be right back with more Face the Nation. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you Thursday along with Nora O'Donnell, John Dickerson, and the rest of our team covering the January 6th hearings at 8 p.m. Eastern Time right here on CBS. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.